Hi, everyone, and welcome to this very, very special episode of Angie Speaks Interviews. Today, I am here with one of my favorite new channels, Meme Analysis, which I discovered a few months ago and just sort of completely enveloped myself down the rabbit hole of this really cool, like Jungian analysis of popular memes. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. Would you like to sort of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your content, what drove you to start making it?
Sure. So the channel is essentially psychological and philosophical analyses of memes. Just basically the idea that memes are more than just a simple joke, but that, like any other kind of joke or simple fantasy, it has a lot of significance unconsciously. And I saw that there was a vacuum. There was nobody who was paying attention to these things as if, they mattered. And so I took the stance and I said, memes matter. And the channel, it was brought into creation that moment.
I really like that you're kind of discussing these kind of Jungian, esoteric, occult ideas in a way that's sort of outwardly focused in terms of analyzing the broader culture, because usually a lot of the Jungian analysis that I see out there, especially on YouTube, is quite banal and sort of inwardly focused. And I think it's really important for people who are of this vein or who have this sort of worldview to also, as within, so without, that kind of thing, kind of focus it outward. How has it been so far? What's your experience been like? Especially because you do talk about certain very contentious areas of culture. What's your experience in terms of like dealing with the internet space been like so far?
I think it's generally very positive, but I also think it's that way because I approach it with a degree of sincerity, because I am not invested completely in it. It's able to just be what it is. I'm able to analyze it because I'm in a position away from it.
Yeah.
So it hasn't affected me terribly. I know a lot of people can be ruined by the attention, just by people knowing you and knowing who you are, or seeing any part of you can be dangerous. And that's such a dangerous thing about being online. One of the big things that I think is just not talked about much. Like, I don't know. I don't know if we should get into a controversial idea just yet, but if you want to, I'll give you one.
Lay it on me. It's fine.
All right.
I'm totally fine with it.
So a lot of people they talk about sex work and being positive about OnlyFans, and kind of generally just disregarding the fact that there are risks. And there are, of course, these kind of old world, like, oh, don't do that, blah, blah, blah. Just like, don't get a tattoo. And just like, they won't want to hire you if you have a tattoo. And I always say to that, like, that doesn't matter as much. That might be outdated. But tattoos, and you're into the occult, tattoos play a symbolic role. Like a tattoo is a sigil. And just in the way that if you have an OnlyFans and enough people see you, if you are not protected, if you are not defending yourself spiritually, there's danger in just being seen by people. Profile pictures, so much power is transferring from people just mindlessly scrolling and looking at you.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you talk about the occult in relation to this. There's that concept of like the gaze, or the power of the gaze, or the power of the evil eye, or the power of like the magician's gaze, for instance, which is like also like a very interesting concept. And yeah, I don't think people really understand like the sort of psychological tax of having a gaze on you at like all times, especially when it comes to, and I guess my sort of quote unquote anti-capitalist critique is like, neoliberalism has encroached upon all areas of the human experience, and it sort of makes it very lucrative to commodify certain aspects of yourself. There's nothing that's off limits. There's nothing that just can belong to you. The most interesting parts of you, your identity specifically, which is like the thing these days, are fodder for a market, and you're supposed to tap into a consumer demographic and have that and be a breadbasket for that consumer demographic. And it can have an incredibly deleterious effect on one's consciousness, for sure. What were you going to say? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but this, I'll respond to that more importantly. Something important about the modern New Age people that I think is likely due to the neoliberal focus is, specifically with Jung and with Crowley, is that they always talk about becoming becoming your true self, but they don't want the products of the true self. They want to have you vulnerable, and people, like, I think the people underplay the concept of persona a lot. Like they only look at persona as a negative. They don't realize that that's what allows us to get through things oftentimes. Like, if we didn't have personas, if we were just ourselves online. And also, I wanted to just clarify, like, you can have a sincere persona. The persona can be a product of sincerity. It doesn't need to always be a fake. So I think it comes down to, like, if you are your true self, you are much easier to manipulate. You are much easier to market to, especially if you believe that. But obviously the person doing their true will is not going to be susceptible to that. A true will.
It's true. And yes, persona is definitely looked down upon. And it's something that I've struggled with a lot, because it's so the thing that, especially, like, I don't know if you've seen, like, the really creepy, like, YouTube creators video, the thing that they show you when you're, like, starting out as a new creator or whatever. And it's like, you need to have a brand, and you need to make yourself, like, stand out from people. So the system in and of itself, like, these platforms, which basically are neoliberal logic, like, made manifest, tells you to put a brand on yourself, but then it also tells you that you need to come across as, like, authentic, and that audiences appreciate authenticity. But when you do anything that shows people that you're actually a human being, they revolt against it. For instance, when it comes to things like ideologies online, where people sort of discuss different political topics, or topics that are sort of linked to specific kind of boutique politics, very sort of niche stuff. If you are seen as being intellectually curious outside of that specific domain, people revolt against it, because really and truly, it's sort of the customer is always right ethos. It's like a consumer ethos, and you're the product that's being consumed by the audience. And if you change anything, or if you do something that's considered outside of what the archetype that you're basically representing in their life, then it's almost like a betrayal, and people do react as if it's a betrayal almost. Have you had any experience with this since you started creating content?
Yeah, every time I do a live stream, I lose not massive amount, but I lose subscribers every time I stream, because I think maybe at that point it becomes clear that I disagree with them wholeheartedly. Like, I don't know. I think people can project onto a video a lot more easily than they can project onto a live stream. Just what I've noticed. Or at least the type of projection is different. Like, I think people project onto live streamers, like video game people, way differently than they project onto a content creator who makes videos. Like, very, very different, because one is playing a different role. So it's funny, I can tell which ideas will get subscribers and which won't, or which will get what kind. And I might lose, this video might gain me this many, and then putting out that video brings it down because they didn't like that. But I'm not, I'm not operating. I don't care. I'm doing the videos that have to be done.
It's interesting, because that's what these platforms sort of incentivize. For you to sort of think about your art or whatever it is that you're trying to put out, like, solely as a product based upon the whims of whatever demographic you're trying to cater to. And there's, like, a punishment reward system based on how well you cater to that demographic. Like, I committed career suicide a long time ago for distancing myself from sort of breadtube and broader sort of left content, because I wanted to not have to deal with the demands of that specific audience and stay truer to my own intellectual curiosity and wanting. And yeah, it caused me a lot of problems. There was a lot of harassment and hate and people like wiling out and just and being crazy. Really and truly, it's kind of like a catch-22 when you make the choice to sort of, you know, be quote unquote as authentic as you possibly can be. You're kind of then responsible for that choice, because these platforms are not here to make your art feel easy to make. They're here to sort of cultivate people's identities and create these sort of demographics. So it's hard to navigate. And I guess you have to sort of make trades and checks and balances here and there and figure out what suits you best. But I mean, it's been a rewarding process for me so far, regardless of all the bullshit. I hope it's also been a rewarding process for you. How are you finding it so far?
Absolutely. But it has been very rewarding. But I wanted to remark on, like, the consumer has been made, they've been softened, they've atrophied. Like, they can only handle what tastes good, you know? Like, it reminds me what Nietzsche talks about. You know, they can only handle, they don't want, you know, they want soft, gentle poisons. They huddle for warmth. They can't handle anything that's like, they don't want anything that's shocking. They don't want anything that disagrees with them. And it's the sign of such a undisciplined mind. And that's what it's encouraged, you know? It's like, no, just eat the same few foods. And some of them actually eat the same few foods. They never expand beyond a certain few types of foods. Like, and to me, that would be tragic.
Yeah. I mean, it's that's kind of the new mode of neoliberalism, the atomized consumer. I mean, before in capitalism, like the nuclear family was considered the ultimate sort of unit of society, but now that's no longer the case. And the nuclear family in and of itself is atomized because obviously before we used to exist in much broader kinship structures. It was easier to raise children with extended members of the family and, you know, multiple networks of friends and distant relatives. Then the nuclear family sort of became this like nionized kind of aspect of, you know, the system. And now it's the atomized consumer. I don't know if you saw it was like the New York Post or something. They had like a front cover that they did a couple of weeks ago that kind of caused a huge stir. And it was like this sort of like lo-fi beats to chill and study to kind of image. And it showed this like woman in her apartment with like Amazon boxes and COVID masks and Chinese food boxes. And it was just this dystopian sort of like horror, like her pill bottles. And yeah, literally her glass of fucking, her like spilled glass of wine, and she's obviously like alone. And it was sort of like, yeah, here we are in this neoliberal utopia. We're now all atomized consumers, totally socially disembedded. And it seems as if the market is stepping in and providing quote unquote solutions, which is what neoliberalism does. It's sort of like market solutions to social problems, and it's sort of providing these solutions for the problems that it's created through things like the parasocial relationships that people develop online that are meant to replace the relationships that they would normally have if they weren't in this sort of atomizing mode. And that's kind of why I'm really interested in this concept of the digital anima, especially with like the popularity of things like e-girls and like OnlyFans and these different sort of, you know, dating simulators, which I didn't even know were a thing until like a couple of weeks ago. And maybe I'm just like naive and like, I didn't even know that that was a thing. But I definitely see this trend of the parasocial being used as a replacement for the social bonds that we were once, it was much easier to sort of facilitate back when all the public domain wasn't totally colonized by capital. What do you think of this concept? I know that you're not necessarily like an anti-capitalist person, so I'm not trying to be like an ideologue. I'm just kind of curious from your perspective how you think this phenomenon works.
So I wrote something down when you were saying that because it was like, it came to me. So, you know, I've talked about the atomized individual before, but I only just now realized after you were because I hadn't heard it in the direct lineage from nuclear family to the atomized individual. And what the internet is doing is it's the Oppenheimer project. It's splitting the atom. It's literally it's fracturing the individual. It's schizophrenizing. And so those rather than two atoms coming together and making a bond, as would be the case in the old world, today, to get fulfillment, you just fracture yourself more.
Yeah.
You just get more and more broken.
Yeah.
And so, yes, and I this is something I was actually just talking about yesterday, which is that I do imagine if the channel receives any, strong degree of popularity, there will be people who will hear my concept of the digital anima or any of these concepts of these archetypes on the internet and say, "Oh, there's the market," and just make intentional thing.
Yeah.
It will be used that way. And
I mean, there is a reason why what I would consider the greatest magicians of the 20th century, there's a reason why, their powers, like Freud and Bernays and all of these different people, their powers were used by capitalism in order to tap into the consciousness of the public and figure out the best way to sort of market to, and these are the power of the unconscious, the power of symbols, the power of our drives and our desires. Instead of it being used to perpetuate like human good, you had like these massive corporations and conglomerations that were employing rooms full of like psychiatrists from like the best universities and rooms full of researchers in order to basically carve out America and England and all of these different places into these demographics that they had an easier time sort of marketing to. So like you could make so much money with the analysis that you have right now, which is the sad thing. Like you could probably help people. You could probably be a marketer in that regard, and that's quite a dark kind of dystopian thought to me. That's what that kind of analysis is like the most useful for in this current paradigm that we're under.
It always struck me that was the real proof of Freud. Like up until Bernays, one could really just say, well, he was a charlatan. He was able to trick people. But once you get to Bernays and once you get to public relations and mass Freudianism, it's no longer deniable. People can say Freud is discredited, but they can't say that public relations doesn't work.
Yeah,
they can't say marketing doesn't work.
Exactly. And I mean, even the idea of the quote unquote rugged sort of atomized individual, the idea that sort of gave birth to the neoliberal paradigm that we're in. It started with Reagan and Thatcher. There's this really good Adam Curtis documentary called The Century of the Self, which basically it outlines this entire thing. But during that time, the analysts who were working on the Reagan and Thatcher campaigns, basically they discovered this demographic called the something along the lines of like the self-impelled individuals, basically. The people who they associated with things like, consumption in order to express individuality, all the things that, sort of represented the hippie movement. And they were like, well, these people are voting for, these people who you would notoriously think of as quote unquote left-wing hippie types are voting for Reagan and Thatcher, because Reagan and Thatcher sort of tailed the message of neoliberalism as it's about individualism, it's about your pursuit of your individual goals, and it's about self-actualization, even though there's nothing wrong with those things, but the mode doesn't actually provide any of those things. All it provides is a consumption path for you to go down endlessly. And, those people who were considered like, the hippies of the old world or whatever, they were marketed to along the lines of this sort of new discovery within psychoanalysts of this specific kind of individual. And the people who voted for Reagan and Thatcher, it crossed racial lines, it crossed class lines, and it also crossed political affiliation. That message resonated with and a lot of the people who call themselves sort of left today are Thatcherites and Reaganites. They're this specific kind of person, and they don't want actual societal change. They just want new consumption paths to be created, ones that sort of validate them, make them feel comfortable, make them feel quote unquote accepted, but it has nothing to do with actual broad systemic change that is going to affect any of our lives in like a positive way. I mean, you know, in the universities, for instance, like most of the students are like in crippling debt, but you don't see any of the quote unquote left academics addressing that. It's all about these sort of atomized identity issues. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I will say is that the reason that individuality is utilized by companies this way, by politics this way, is because it is the ultimate hope, because it is the only tool that can undo them. It must be perverted. So it's important to distinguish between the individualism trademark and individualism. And that, of course, is the confusion that occurs in the New Age person. They confuse reading individual written by somebody 300 years ago with what individual means today. And they're essentially direct opposites. And
it's so true. And that's also not just a problem of the New Age, but a problem of the left. The left also kind of rejects the idea of the individual while also completely being subsumed within it. So it creates this, again, this deterritorialization, this sort of schizophrenia. And that's kind of, that's an issue that I definitely think needs to be stressed, is that when we're talking about individual TM, that's different from the individual in the psychological sense, which is incredibly important. And something that shouldn't be destroyed. And that's sort of an accusation that gets levied by the right wing or like apolitical people a lot. And they're not wrong in the sense that it's like, yeah, there is a sort of disdain for the individual on the left, but it's a misguided one. And it's because there hasn't been a whole lot of work done to unpick these concepts. And there is no left. I mean, and there's no organized institutional left. Like the people who, there are people who intellectually identify with some of the ideas of the left, but there's no organized institutional left. The people who call themselves left now are basically the perfect neoliberal subjects, in my mind anyway. And a lot of what the pathologies we're seeing sort of stem from the overarching dominant ideology, which is that of neoliberalism. It just does a great job of making itself invisible and sort of look like a state of nature to most people, even though it's an ideology. And we're supposed to be in this post-ideological period. I know that you talked about that on your channel. What are your observations about ideology and the way that it operates?
So that's, this is the realm of the digital animus. So I know that we didn't really delve into those, so I'll just try to give like a brief So the anima in Jung's idea and the animus are both the opposite gender projection. They're the archetype that arises. So a young man growing up will form an anima. He has an internal archetype, and it is filled by phenomena. It's filled by his life. Women have the same thing, but with an animus, where it is unconscious within them from birth, but it is filled by the men in their life. But like everything else, it has been subsumed by capital and by the internet, to the point where there is no. So in the past, I've talked about the idea, the girl next door, which in the past would have been the image of your anima. Sometimes, of course, there's Mother Mary. There's all kinds of these projected divine feminine figures. But what has happened is that this has been put into the internet, and not just yours, but everybody's. And because you are in a shared culture, because we are all humans, we all have similar archetypal traits for our animas and our animuses. So they form collective online archetypes. It's kind of a new form of archetypal interaction. Jung noticed that governments became increasingly more archetypal. Communist governments and fascist governments were both more archetypal than the kind of enervated monarchies that had existed in Europe before. Revolutionary governments were more directly unconscious. Fascist governments were more directly unconscious. And today, the figures that exist online and that work through the internet are the most unconscious to the point. So I've talked about the digital anima plenty. I would like to talk about the digital animus, which to me, the animus of the internet is a minotaur. I've talked about the fact that the internet is a web and a labyrinth. It is a labyrinthine web. But the important thing is, there's not just a spider in the web, there's a minotaur in the labyrinth. And just as the digital anima as a spider is kind of harnessing energy.
Libidinal energy.
And that's distinctly sexual libido, because it functions pornographically, especially. But the digital animus is not so much that. It is a significantly more political figure. The minotaur is kind of the Nick Fuentes, or the Richard Spencer, or the Vosh, or any of these figures that prop themselves up online and say, I have the answer, I know what's going on politically, and they get people angry. And they get people mad, and they show, these are the problems. This is what's going on. And then people say yes, and they give their energy. They give their energy to them. So they operate, while the digital anima is kind of enveloping sexual energy, the minotaur is invoking anger and getting all of this energy. But the important thing is that in the past, a human minotaur might have actually caused political change, or the Whore of Babylon, or any popular whore would have actually changed the world with sex and with her influence over things. But today, they serve solely to destroy potential action. The fact that there are popular politics on the internet is anathema to effective politics. A minotaur doesn't actually want people to go out and revolt. It doesn't want that. It wants you to stay in the labyrinth. And so that's the problem. People, and this is the joy of it for young people. They don't realize that all of their political ideas are literally meaningless, because it does nothing. Their day-to-day life does not change in any meaningful way based on what they believe. A big litmus to me is this, the phrase, the red pill. People talk about taking the red pill. But in the Matrix, when Neo takes the red pill, everything changes. His life changes. But today, when you take the red pill, nothing happens. You might just get more isolated, more lonely. Nothing changes.
I really love this concept of these sort of archetypes sapping our libidinal forces in that regard, because you definitely see that in these carved out internet demographics that really take themselves very seriously. They become less, so if we're talking about from the animus perspective, where it's about harvesting that sort of libidinal anger or fervor or verve that would otherwise be spent having action, doing action in the world. It sort of reminds me of, you've seen Hurley Mountain, right? The scene where there's that sort of masculinist cult of the phallus. It kind of reminds me a lot of that, how the libido of these young men is sort of being siphoned for things like war, siphoned for things and that was sort of the old world. Whereas now the libido is sort of, I feel like, because it's antithetical to what the system is trying to create, which is atomized subjects, is sort of being funneled down this rabbit hole where it has it's just sort of endlessly kind of titillated, but there's never any sort of change that comes from it. And I definitely resonate with this, because especially in these atomized internet communities, you definitely see a lot of sort of impotence and a lot of punitive, ugly, angry kind of behaviors towards other communities and one another, because that libido is always being titillated but has nowhere really to go. I really like that concept, but I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about the digital animus, since before we get into the digital animus, because this is a concept that really fascinates me. Like I call myself like a witch. I also work very intensely and closely with the concept of the divine feminine. It's something that's definitely enriched my life and psyche, in terms of coming, growing and sort of individuating as a woman, finding what it means for me to be a woman, coming to terms with, things that culture kind of tells me to repress in a sense, from a young age, especially around things like my body and sexuality, and also, its reproductive faculties, these different aspects, especially because of like the advent of like neoliberal sort of feminism, which only solely focuses on the woman as worker, or the woman as, and specifically like kind of middle class white kind of women. That's what it's pretty much for. That's the ultimate sort of feminist subject. It doesn't talk about working class women or women who don't work, women who do the domestic labor. It's not about any of those things. And it was very difficult for me to sort of find areas of my life where I was comfortable. Like I'm quite comfortable like in the home, doing domestic shit, being a home person. I do want children one day. But I also really like having a career. I really like doing things in the world. I like to be active in the world. There are all these different facets of me, and working with the divine feminine as a concept has been very helpful for me, like dealing with these archetypal energies, seeing areas of myself within these archetypal energies, seeing areas of my faults and my shadow within these archetypal energies, and also seeing how some of the mythos is living through me in a way has also been very sort of fascinating. But then I come across this concept of the digital anima, which you've coined, and this is almost like a darker, more shadowy, macro cultural manifestation of the divine feminine principle. And it frightened me a little bit because, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept of like Kali, for instance, and these sort of, or like Catonic, like never pronounce that word, Catonic goddesses, and the dark goddess, these sort of goddesses that represent nature, primal nature that is unfettered from the human gaze or the human mind. And I'm familiar with the sort of beauty and horror that's associated with those kinds of archetypes. But I never really thought of how a dark mother would exist in our very modern context where nature has been mostly subdued. And yeah, it really, especially around the area of sexuality, which is like where, dealing with the divine feminine is like, really helped me sort of unleash and sort of feel myself as a woman in that way. And it also kind of put me in contact with this wild, like insatiable, just really insatiable kind of like appetite in that regard. And it was something that initially frightened me, but then seeing it in this sort of darker form, manifesting in this digital context in the way that you've described it, really frightened me. And I guess maybe because in my head, I still see the divine feminine as like the mother, the sort of goddess like archetype. Go. Sorry.
The divine feminine is triple.
Yes.
Hecate is a triple goddess.
Yeah.
And if you look at culture today, really only one of them exists, and that's the maiden, the sexual, happy working girl.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the past it was a farmhand, but today she's the working girl.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no mother. The mother is gone.
Yeah.
And there is certainly no grandmother. The grandmother is injecting Botox, trying to be the maiden. It has repressed completely the majority of the divine feminine has been repressed.
Yeah.
And what Freud, this is the essential idea. There is always a return of the repressed in a more horrific form. So we kind of have a double whammy with the digital anima, where we have repressed the aspect of femininity, but the internet itself is a repression of nature, or it was meant to be. It's the person represses their drive to go outside and chooses to go into the internet. And so one of my essential theses is that the internet is a Catonic realm. The internet is Catonic. And so it has Catonic gods and goddesses, dark, earthen forms. Like, we are not, and I talked about it, I think, with Uberboyo, like the phrase of the ether net is a misnomer, because the ether is the angelic above, but we have a net over it. You can't get to it. It looks like it. It has the aesthetics. It has the guise of freedom, of civility, but the reality of it is Catonic. And you can see it when you pay attention to the memes, to the comments.
It's so fascinating to me as well, because the digital anima, as you described her, is this sort of libidinal harvesting manifestation of the divine feminine. And in that sense, like you said, the maiden no longer, and it sort of reflects how a lot of women feel in modern society, where there's, youth and beauty now are valued more than ever because they're commodities. Like the entire sort of feminine form has turned into a commodity. And you're sort of always trying to sort of keep up, and you need to brand yourself, you need to find your niche. And for women, and I don't want to like speak pejoratively because I know people get annoyed, but generally in terms of like cultural conditioning, and also like the cultures that women have sort of developed for ourselves over the eons, blah, blah, blah. The way that we sort of feel our libido is by being seen. It's different generally for men. Men's libido is stimulated by their gaze, the penetration, the act of viewing. Whereas for women, we are stimulated by being viewed. That's how our libido rises. We're stimulated by our own image. Like you hear a lot of women talk about, like, when they're engaged in sexual acts with their partner, they are turned on by the idea of themselves performing those sexual acts, which is something that you sort of see. It's, of course, it exists in the male psyche as well, but generally it's associated with like the female psyche. And that's kind of, a lot of women online are, because you talk about it from the male perspective of how they project these sort of unrealized feminine aspects of themselves onto these influences, or onto e-girls, or onto cartoon characters, anime characters, video game characters. Like, there's so many different forms that the digital anima inhabits. But for women, one of the ways that we feel our libido is by feeling as if we inhabit one of the many forms of the digital anima. So you have a lot of women who try to sort of make themselves unreal. It's a very limiting, ugly space to exist in, to try to constrain yourself into something that's one-dimensional, and to become, one of the sort of faces of this digital anima that's manifesting and harvesting libido on that. But then it's also within us as women, because there's like, again, from dealing with the darker aspects of the divine feminine, there's an aspect within me that enjoys the process of taking in the libido, ingesting it within myself. Sorry, this is starting to sound sort of animalistic, but yeah, there's a pleasure. There's a pleasure, and there's sort of an intensity from ingesting within in the libido. So you're given those rewards on behalf of this digital anima. You're also experiencing your libido by being seen, and then you're sort of harvesting the libido. It's a very weird, complex thing, and I don't think a lot of women even realize or know that that's what they're doing, or that they're part of this process.
No, and I'm so happy that you brought that up, because, like, you're the first one. You intuited completely what is going on. Like, at least according to my ideas, like what I've observed is completely the same thing, where young women, especially like on TikTok or OnlyFans or wherever they're a public face, they don't realize that, like, it's not them. It's the digital anima that these young men see in them. Just as a good actor is playing the role well, and the person likes that role, they don't like that actor. And I think that, unfortunately, like, I think a lot of the popularity, like misogyny, I think is accelerating, in part due to the digital anima. Like, the digital anima wants young men to be misogynistic.
Yeah.
It wants misogyny. And so when the young man worships at the altar of the e-girl, a living one, They build up the divine image.
Mm.
And then, let's say, by some miracle, I know not a lot of the young guys who are worshiping at the feet of e-girls are probably not getting a date, but let's say they get a date. Or it might also be retro causal. It might be the other way around, where a young man goes on a date, enjoys being with this girl, then finds out she has an OnlyFans and is like, no, casts her aside. And real women are bad. Real women are filthy. Real women are the bad thing. I'm going to go with the pure digital girl.
Anima.
I'm going to go with my, with my own soul. And so misogyny is like, yes, stay focused on me, don't go outside. And so the young girls who are like making money and getting famous doing this are also, and it's not their fault. It's not just like it's not the young men's fault. They're playing out an archetypal dynamic that neither's aware of, but it is alienating both.
Yes.
They're becoming alienated.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is on the feminine side of this equation, you are feeling all of this validation and attention. You're being, and that's like I said, the way that we generally experience our libido is through the act of being seen or being perceived as sexual. And they can teeter towards objectification. It can teeter towards like romance and it depends on the person and the makeup of their psyche. But it's as if the normal attention that you would get from a partner is no longer enough to satiate the appetite that is within you, this insatiability, and then I see this happening because I have quite a few friends who are sex workers online or who are sex workers or who are e-girls or whatever, and like there's this sort of insatiability to the amount of attention that it takes to satisfy them, or it takes to make them feel good. There are a lot of them who are incredibly beautiful women, but don't feel good about themselves or don't believe it. And they feel like they have to constantly enter the feedback loop in order to experience themselves as sexual beings. Their entire libido is sort of caught up in this exchange. And a lot of the ones I know have a lot of problems in terms of holding down normal, bread and butter relationships and having partnerships with other people, and even sexual dysfunction too. You would think that, because a lot of people do like a lot of sexual kind of LARPing online and stuff, but in real life, if you meet people and you sort of see that there's a lot of sexual dysfunction because the libido is being sort of displaced into this chthonic realm and not necessarily expressing itself properly in reality. And yeah, it's very tempting to attempt to slot yourself into one of these digital anima holes that's like readily available for you, but like you said, it's sort of a waste of libidinal energy. And anima projection is also not real like love. And I know it's like weird to say that because it's obvious, but like people are so caught up in these parasocial relationships that they don't even, and even offline. I mean, I guess it happens to a lot of women who are sort of witchy. Anima projection like happens to you quite a bit, and even in real life, it's not like love. It's or even affection. It's you're a vessel for something greater than yourself. You're a vessel for something gargantuan that you have very little control over, and it's terrifying. It's a terrifying experience. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about like the concept of the e-girl specifically, because you did a video on that I found really sort of fascinating. Would you like to talk a little bit about this trend and what your thoughts are on it?
Mm-hmm. So, it's brought to an extreme in that case of Bianca Devins. Do you remember this?
Mm-mm.
Young girl who had like a big, like not a big, but she had a following. Because she, she posted pictures, and her boyfriend murdered her and beheaded her. Whoa. And posted pictures of it.
Oh my God.
That is like the horrific acceleration of that misogyny. It says you are not, because the head is that ego. The head is that the profile picture. It's like, no, no, no. It's just the ultimate saying no. It's horrific, but I definitely foresee more horrific violence if there is not legitimate outreach, legitimate, growth that will occur, which obviously I'm trying to help. But no, I think like there's so much danger in it, and it's not recognized because of this kind of like, and that's another one of the good tricks Capital played on the left is like blind sex work positivity.
Oh God.
So never talk about any risks. And I'm not saying sex work is bad. I'm just saying recognize that there are risks.
Feel free, because I'm actually working on a video. I have like a very strong anti-capitalist critique of it. Also, most of the like Marxist theorists, like Rosa Luxemburg, like they had critiques of sex work. Like this sort of new form of lionization is distinctly neoliberal. But I don't want to get into that. But you continue saying what you were saying.
But so yeah, Reich, most important figure if you're going to have a Marxist analysis of sexuality.
Yeah.
And that's I've never understood how the left got by without Freud, which is to say they never did. Whereas the right at least understood that you have to be a father figure. They didn't quit on what worked. Whereas the left looked at like, this is what worked, let's not do that. It's very bizarre. But one of the other things is that like, we are certainly figures as well. We are not immune to this. Like I know many of my subscribers look at me as a father figure. They project that onto me. And what I would say, to any of the sons watching this, you have no earthly father. That's a line that was in a dream. But you have no earthly father. When you say I am your father, or when they love you, it's not me and it's not you. It's just them put into us. And in shamanism, there is a massive working, which is to collect every piece of your soul before you die, because you put it into things. You leave your soul with people and with objects, and you need to get it back to be able to make it through to other realms. And that's going to be one of the great workings for young people is like, where did you leave these parts of you? Who is a vessel of yours? Who occupies that role to you? Maybe you forgot.
It's interesting though, because this is sort of where I sort of split off in my critique from sort of the standard sort of critique of these things. Because I feel like it tends to individualize these like very systemic problems in the same way that like, companies have adopted yoga and meditation in order to deal with the crushing alienation that their workers are experiencing. I try to sort of avoid like a do better kind of analysis, because this is what the mode is pushing people to do. It's sort of playing on our drives and forcing us to marketize and commodify ourselves and to put ourselves in these slots. So it's a broader systemic issue. And I mean, of course, being more conscious about it is important, and in being able to spread the information about it is also important. But there's this sort of very kind of Randian, like almost like a viewed personal responsibility thing that gets put on people, and I feel like that ends up creating a little bit more alienation in a sense, because it's such a if you're totally fucking responsible, and if you fall into any of these traps, then that means that you have failed to integrate and individuate. It sort of creates this endless self-excavation that can also be quite alienating to people. And I mean, especially to sort of young women, again, it's incredibly lucrative to be, and this has always been, I mean, I've been reading, because for the video that I'm doing, I've been reading about the French court, and also of Louis V, and also reading about France in like the early 1900s and like the proliferation of prostitution, and how all these sort of young middle class girls with these sort of coquettish fantasies, who wanted to be sort of the grande dame of like Paris, would go into the city centers and go to the places where high society where they could be visible, in order to sort of secure futures for themselves. Usually women who were either parts of the members of the gentry, or poor women who didn't have massive economic kind of standing, would go. This was like sort of a path for them. Same in Japan with sort of the tradition of the geisha. That was one of the only professions where women weren't tethered to men, where they owned wealth, and where they so there are economic forces that were sort of driving, and societal forces as well, that were sort of driving people into these professions. I mean, nowadays, work is incredibly alienating and precarious for most people. We are in an era of 0-hour contracts. We're in an era of, all kinds of soul-crushing, alienating labor, and also an era where, automation is coming in and people are losing jobs and all of those different things. And, capitalism is now saying, hey, what about you can you monetize? What about you can be the gold mine that you are using to make yourself live a better life? And even the sort of testimonials that people who do OnlyFans put out about, I just like posted these pictures of my tits, and I have a house, and I have a decent standard of living. A lot of young women look up to that, and they don't just see it as an outlet for their libido, but they also see it as a means to economic access, which is sad, because the majority of people who do work on OnlyFans don't make that much money. That's also sort of a marketing gimmick that the company is doing. And then in terms of like the digital anima and the way that we experience our libido, I mean, for me, it's quite terrifying. I mean, like you said, certain people view you as a father figure. People have legitimately call me mommy on a lot of like different occasions, and it fucking freaks me out. Like it's terrifying to me. Like I'm like a walking like womb. Like I'm this like weird like fertility thing, and it happens a lot to women in general, but specifically, especially in America with Black women as well. I know that people call Kamala Harris Mamala. You have like the Oprah figure, and there's also been that sort of one of the animas, the many animas of American culture is the mammy, especially because she nursed the children. Usually she was like a wet nurse, and she's seen as this sort of benevolent, docile figure. And I'm everything, but I'm not docile. I'm definitely not docile. I'm not always benevolent. And I've noticed a distinct kind of backlash when you're a Black woman and you're opinionated, or you're not going to sort of coddle and cater to your demographic. That's almost what people put you there for.
Well, look at Kanye. Kanye is like the exact male. Like he, by not being Jim Crow, he is like, he's bipolar, he's psychologized. Oh, he must be ill. Why isn't he?
Azealia Banks as well. I find her incredibly fascinating too, and the amount of sort of disdain that people have for, like, I feel like if she was a man, it would be very different in terms of the way people sort of view the things she says and does, and how she's, because there's a lot of truth to a lot of things she says, even though she doesn't necessarily deliver it in the most tactful way. But people don't look past that, because there's almost like this like weird like know your place kind of thing. And then there's also the sort of projection of oneself into these anima forms, and how it alienates one from one's actual sexuality. I know you have a video on sex magic on your channel, on Crawley and sex magic, which is something that I've dabbled in quite frequently over the last couple of years. It's really been eye-opening for me, like very eye-opening in terms of harnessing and understanding and controlling the libido, and also trying to put that libidinal energy towards better use. Is this something that you would recommend to people in order to sort of know themselves more in that sense? I don't necessarily recommend it, because it's not for the faint of heart, and it's also not always like it's, you can really mess shit up for yourself if you're not like adept. But what do you think about the concept of sex magic in terms of as a tool to sort of train the libido?
Yes, but also I think that there should be preliminaries. Like, I think that's one of the tragic things about the popularization of magic is that it's all on the table, and what would have in the past been down the line after you developed, and then it would work. But for people who just jump in, it's not, it might just be a negative. Like, I don't know. I think more people should start with something like yoga, but not the modern yoga, but they should start with, start with just, can you control your own body? And if you can't control your own body, how are you going to do sex magic? If you can't sit still for fucking 10 minutes, you're not ready for sex magic. So I would suggest sitting still. Sitting still for a long time and then getting into it. But yeah, certainly it can be very helpful and very useful. And I do think that it will eventually be much more normal. But I also think that there's going to have to be more popular kind of plans or, grades, degrees. But something I wanted to talk about, like, I think it's important to, I don't know, I am certainly I believe in great man theory. Like, I am not, like, how can one change the world without growing individually? It is on the back of the individual to become even to become a vessel for something greater that will change the world. Hegel certainly knew it, and like Lenin was an individual. He was able to cause revolution, but it was through individual pursuit of it. And the other thing is that, like, the individual does not necessarily need to be atomized. In fact, Jung viewed the individuation process as the process of recognizing who you are in the world. It's not like go away, never come back. It's more so be who you are, but be among the people. You cannot abandon life, which is what many people do when they think, I'm enlightened, I'm going to turn away from the world. And I think that a figure like a Lenin or a D'Annunzio, who are individuals who change their environment into they just it was the time and they did it. But you do have to, like, the fact that we do not inspire action anymore, I think, is because of this blind collectivism, which is what digital environments cater to. It caters to the mass audience. And the individual is reduced to the content creator. They're not a real creator. They're not a real artist. So I think it comes down to a dignified form of the individual and a dignified form of the mass. But I do think we cannot write off the individual in the political dynamic at all.
And that's been one of the biggest mistakes of the left, in my opinion, because they associate, like we said at the beginning, the individual with the individual TM rather than the sort of broader understanding of that concept. And it's definitely something that shouldn't be left on the chopping board. But going back to the idea of the digital anima, before we move on to the animus, I promise we're getting there. I find it fascinating. You sort of talk about the idea of the devouring mother, or the archetype of the devouring mother. And this was something that I came into contact with through exploring the divine feminine, through exploring concepts like sex magic, the wilder, more primal and terrifying aspects of being a woman, or feminine energy, or whatever you want to call it. And one of the archetypes that came to me was Kali. That was sort of the archetype that was invoked within me. And it was a very sort of terrifying experience, especially because I grew up in a Christian household. And this sort of tradition, I'm half Nigerian, half Arab. So those are the two kind of cultural forces that I grew up with, one very Christian, the other very Muslim, both cultures where female sexuality, especially because of the advent in Yoruba culture specifically, which is where I'm from in Nigeria, the divine feminine had a very sort of high place. But then through the advent of, Christianization, colonialism, more patriarchal ideas sort of took over our notions of masculinity and femininity. And the female sexuality, which was once celebrated and lionized as this like life-giving force, was then repressed. And that was sort of the context I grew up in, was the idea that like men were more sexual and that women's libidos were like not as sexual. But then when I sort of started to discover my own libido and dive more deeply into my libido, and I found Kali, which was terrifying to me because it was this insatiable force. And it, you know, you hear stories about, you know, when you like read certain anthropologists, especially like ones who have a more mystical tint, the idea that female sexuality was sort of repressed because it triggered masculine insecurities and the masculine kind of fear of not being able to perform or invalidation or any of those things. But there is really something insatiable there that never really gets talked about. And even in our so-called sexually liberated society, it's sort of a hush-hush thing. And I mean, that it's not as if the insatiability is necessarily inherently bad in any sort of way, but it's manifesting itself through this sort of devouring mother on the internet, this harnessing of libido that doesn't go anywhere. And I know that you've had this debate with other people. This devouring mother archetype, let's just sort of say that it's real. Do you think it has any aims or plans for the libido that it's harvesting? Do you think there's some sort of grand plan, or is it just sort of an empty hole?
It's an empty hole for sure. But I think like one of the very important distinctions that has to be made, and that I think a lot of people make the mistake, where they assume that the dignified mother is the original, that's the real one. But they are both, you know, they're both created at the same time. The devouring mother and the good mother are the exact same thing. They were created at the same time. It's not just a perversion. It is the same thing. Both are wholes. One is productive and one is consumptive. And so it simply must be recognized that the devouring mother is an integral function of femininity, just as the devouring father is for masculinity. Nobody will deny that war is man's nature, but nobody can accept that infanticide is in woman's nature as well. Men love to kill their boys, but they're able to moralize it because it's big. Because we kill a lot of boys at the same time, it's okay. It was for a reason. It was for a cause. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It was that was Saturn getting hungry.
Yeah. Yeah. And the rationalization is the logos. Again, it's that sort of masculine principle, the ability to the impulse to rationalize, the impulse to organize and create sort of order in that regard is traditionally sort of archetypally considered masculine, whereas the feminine is and that's because a lot of lefties, and I apologize for my breed, really despise the Jordan Peterson equation of chaos with the feminine and order with the masculine. But it's because the left, again, suffers from the same cultural schizophrenia and deterritorialization. They don't understand that masculine and feminine, these polarities are how human cultures for aeons have organized concepts. It has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with your specific proclivities. Like, we're all sort of a massive makeup of all types, but the logos being viewed as masculine is a cultural sort of shorthand in the same way that the chaos principle, and chaos isn't necessarily bad either. The fact that they view chaos as bad, chaos is something that I identify with. Like I said, like the goddess Kali, for instance, represents the unfettered feminine principle, unfettered nature that is completely indifferent to the human gaze. And the last thing I kind of wanted to get into around this concept is the monastic tradition, which is where I think a lot of people get worried about this concept, because obviously within the monastic traditions of the East, there was this sort of almost spiritual misogyny where the feminine was viewed with suspicion, the idea of the mind being the masculine. And you know, traditions like Buddhism and sects of Hinduism and Jainism were sort of more interested in the cultivation, control of the mind, and divorce from the material world. And the material world was sort of viewed as feminine. So it was sort of a rejection of the feminine principle. And you even see it within these sort of monastic traditions where women were not allowed to be in them. And there are certain sects of Buddhism that believe that women were inherently tethered to the earth because of their reproductive faculties in a way that men weren't. So there was no way that a woman could achieve enlightenment, that she would have to wait till her next lifetime to be reborn a man in order to achieve enlightenment. Even the concept of like the daughters of Mara, when the Buddha is in the lotus position and he's meditating, what does Mara send? This sort of seductive, dancing anima to distract this sort of very kind of stoic man from his cultivation and excavation of the masculine principle, the mind. You have the story with Shiva and Parvati. Shiva, he's the hermit. He's the ultimate renouncer. He's the person who is untethered from the material world, the archetype of the masculine principle. And it takes Parvati to open him through compassion, or Tara, depending on with the Buddha or whatever, depending on what archetypal system you're using. It takes Parvati to open him to compassion, to show him that, you know, that the emotional dimension, the feminine principle, like, matters. There's that story where Shiva, Parvati wants to create a kitchen in their home, and he says no. So she leaves and walks away. And then his followers come, the followers of Shiva come, and they ask him for food, and they say, we're hungry, and he doesn't have anything to give them. So he wanders the world and is denied food everywhere he goes. But then he finally comes to Parvati's kitchen, and she's prepared a meal, and she says, you may have overcome hunger, but the people who follow you haven't. You still need to have compassion for those people. And that sort of teaches Shiva to engage with the feminine principle, you know, the pleasures, the fulfillment of needs, all of these different things that have sort of been renounced. And I guess when it comes to the concept of the digital anima, a lot of men could view this sort of thing as this consumptive force, this sort of dark feminine, this devouring mother, and sort of take on a renouncing kind of aesthetic kind of position against it, this sort of rejection of the feminine, instead of an integration healthily of it. What do you think of this concept, especially as ties to the sort of monastic traditions?
This is why Nietzsche is so integral to my thought. We must get rid of the ascetic cruelty to the self and to others.
Mm-hmm.
Not cruelty, but ascetic cruelty. That is the real problem, is that why is it all of the, not all, but a majority of the intelligent people throughout human history have pretty much said, fuck it. I'm staying at home. I'm going inside. I'm not coming out. That's weakness, and it's spiritual narcotics. Mm-hmm. It's a spiritual narcotic. It's perhaps the most negative imaginable response. Mm-hmm. Whereas Nietzsche, he looks at the world as the monstrous interplay of energies that it is, and he says yes. He says yes to the world. And I never, ever, ever, ever say no matter how bizarre or disgusting. I say yes to the world. And I think people who say no to the digital anima are just as likely to say no to the anima, because they are ascetics. But that's okay. Yeah. That's what they're going to do. You know, maybe in the next world they can recognize the joy of the body. They can become a body, you know, to be fully human. Like that. This is also why Reich is so important to me. The unconscious is the body, which is to say that all, like, even though, and Jung is very careful to say that we perceive the soul as numinous, as air, as ethereal, but that it is us. It is in us, and it is our body. Though I do recognize, like, the unconscious is relative. It is our body, but it is our body throughout space and time. So there's weird shit going on, of course, but at the most important place, we are our body. We are our body, and
that's sort of a primacy, though, of the quote unquote divine feminine, which is sort of what you see a lot of these different monastic cultures sort of come to the conclusion. Like in Buddhism, that was why Tara was introduced. She's the one who teaches the Buddha compassion and engagement. He becomes a bodhisattva rather than transcending into the realm of transcendence in order to help humanity. You sort of see the divine feminine figures come in and sort of re-engage these monastic, untethered male figures with material reality, the body. One of the things that you taught, and that's the reason why I sort of see this digital anima as being somewhat antithetical to the divine feminine principle as I understand it, because it takes one away from experience of the body, and it takes one away from the experience of reality, and it also takes one away from the experience of one's libido. So I don't understand what about it is intrinsically quote unquote divine feminine other than its aesthetic qualities.
How do you not see the devouring mother as natural?
Actually, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, it's more of, yeah, I understand what you're saying, because that's like, also an aspect. Yeah.
The digital anima is simply, it's an aesthetic form of the devouring mother. Mm-hmm. But the important thing is that the devouring mother is so repressed. It comes back as a scourge. Yes, the divine feminine, after being rejected, was still, was good to those ascetics who came back. But that might have been a time of kindness. Like, archetypes and entities generally are not just these happy, helpful beings. They have their own will. They are autonomous, and what is good and bad to us is not important to them. If the devouring mother wants to eat, it's not I think it's important to not moralize these things, because the devouring mother is not intentionally evil. She is hungry. Just like the good mother is not intentionally good. She just has to create. She wants to create. What, we can't make it about good and evil without getting rid of, because that's exactly the thing. If you uphold the divine feminine as good, you will repress what is part of it, what is the evil aspect as we view it. But if you can just recognize it as this is what we do, just like I was saying, like one might say, well, the devouring father is not masculine. It just has the aesthetic of masculinity, but that denies what it is to be masculine. Just like to deny the devouring aspect of femininity is to deny femininity itself.
It's true. I think, yeah, definitely. It's difficult because we're obviously programmed to see it in moral terms. But what I see in culture now is sort of a denial of the sort of benevolent father, and an acceptance of the devouring father, and a denial of the devouring mother, and sort of acceptance of the sort of more positive, quote unquote, according to the human gaze, aspects of the divine feminine. And that sort of created this weird deleterious sadness between the sexes as well. There's a lot of confusion and resentment, and also in terms of like, I remember, I forget who it was who said it, who was sort of talking about Me Too as sort of an kind of unintegrated manifestation of the animus within the feminine, the animus being the thing that sets boundaries, that says no, that sort of fights, and that sort of protects the more sort of gentle aspects of the feminine principle. And how the animus is sort of manifesting itself through these sort of neoliberal forms of feminism, and they're acting in these really pernicious ways, because again, there's this denial of the consumptive mother, the consumptive aspects of the feminine, and then all of the benevolent aspects of the father archetype are repressed in favor of the war mongering consumptive father, which is what the major sort of prime archetype. And yeah, I think there are a lot of like young men and young women who feel very alienated in this terrain where you're not fully allowed to sort of accept and integrate all parts of yourself, and also accept and integrate all parts of culture as well, and humanity, and who we are. But I guess let's move on to the animus, since we also wanted to talk about that. So you talked a little bit about the Minotaur and the fact that it's this sort of it harnesses like things like anger, this other form of libidinal energy. And you mentioned a few key figures who you think are representative of this animus. And do you think it's similar to the digital anima in the sense that you think it's a consumptive force that goes nowhere, that it's just sort of an abortion of this energy, this sort of libidinal energy?
Yes. You know, I'm not. Did you ever read Psychic Self-Defense?
Mm-mm.
That was one of the big influences on Lynch and Frost when they made Twin Peaks. So Garmin Boja.
Yeah.
They want pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Because that's what they live on. It's food. It's energy. There is no goal, I think. I could be wrong. This is just a little human mind thinking about something that's much bigger. But from what I can observe, they are very simplistic archetypes. Like, I think that Christ is one of the most advanced archetypes. For many reasons. Like, it's a complex story. Many of the gods that arose from the Greeks and Romans, Christians, Hinduism, these are increasingly more and more advanced compared to old pagan, really old rites. They're progressing from masculine and feminine as pure and undifferentiated into good women and bad women, good men and bad men, and so on and so on, expanding and expanding and making more and more gods. So I think that, to me, what is occurring, because I'm a massive fan of Aleister Crowley, and I really think he was right. I think that in the fact that we have reached the Aeon of Horus, the Aeon of Aquarius, the age of the child, what he called the crowned and conquering child, I view the mass appearance of the digital anima and the digital animus as these devouring mothers and fathers as a defense mechanism against the collective becoming child that's occurring. Instead of being 1 second. The internet laptop was not charging. Battery was dying.
It's all good. It's all good. If it does die, then I'll just add you back in. Okay, we got it.
All right. Instead of becoming individual, instead of taking on the responsibility of becoming the crowned and conquering children that we are reverting to the infantile child. We want mommy and daddy. We want mommy and daddy to consume us. What the heck is the word? Reciprocal. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's not just like, oh, these poor little babies are getting eaten. It's like these babies are kind of crawling into the mouth. They're crawling into the maw. Like, they want it.
Yeah.
They don't want to become, powerful. We don't want to take on the responsibility to change the world. We would much rather lay on old world comfort. Yeah.
It's so true. It's this sort of Oedipal desire, and that's also being facilitated by the system. Like I said, the atomized consumer in their cocoon, ordering Amazon boxes with an endless stream of entertainment and video games and all of these different things, and internet personalities and all of these different things to sort of shroud them in this sort of womb-like cocoon. And it's sort of it's a replacement and as sort of an excuse to obfuscate the responsibility we have to, like you said, become the becoming child. It's interesting that you mentioned Crowley and his aeonic cosmology, which is something I've always found incredibly fascinating, especially as an Aquarius, since we are entering the age of Aquarius. What's your sign, by the way? What do
you think? What would you guess?
Okay. I'm guessing, I can't guess the sign, but I could guess the element, I think. And I get either, I think either you are air sign kin like me, or water. Are you a water sign? Are you a fire sign?
I have water rising. I'm a Scorpio rising.
Oh, you're a Scorpio rising. Wow. Wait, so I thought Scorpio was a water sign.
Scorpio's water, but my son is Sagittarius.
Oh my God. Okay. So Sagittarius. Okay. So my partner is a Sagittarius as well. So Sagittarius and Aquarius get along very, very well. And I'm a Sagittarius moon as well. So definitely. I don't get on with other air signs though. I've come to the conclusion, because I meet them and I'm like, oh, we're very similar and we have all this stuff going on. But then there's always that like contention of the fact that we're always up here and less down there. And I love being around fire signs because they bring me out of like here and into like here. So yeah, like that's super cool. But yeah, like the Crowley's aeonic cosmology is very interesting. And I mean, one of the things that the left has sort of shied away from is the idea of aeonic cosmology because of things like Blavatsky and the idea that it has some form of like esoteric fascist undertone to it or whatever. But would you like to sort of explain Crowley's aeonic cosmology and what the concept of aeon means for the people who don't know?
So just as the zodiac it's a procession of equinoxes where, you know, we move through the zodiac over a course of around 2,000 years about. So the idea is essentially that our human lives, and especially our religions and world views, are created and affected by the aeon. So, for example, the pagans, Greeks and Romans, were under Aries, and their religion was fiery. They worshipped gods with horns. You know, there was a very primal, animalistic element. With Christianity, literally, and I mean literally, Pan, the horned god, dies and is announced dead by the Romans. I mean, he is dead, and it's recorded. 14 years later, Christ is born, and we have entered the Aeon of Pisces. So we witness the death of the Aeon of Aries. We move into the Aeon of Pisces, and now Christ is a fish. He's a fisherman. He's a fisher of men. And he is still Christians wear like fish rings and fishes on their bumper stickers because they believe that he's a fish god. But now that we are reaching the Aeon of Aquarius, we are reaching the Aeon of the individual. It is the water-bearing individual. And to me, like, the ultimate Aquarius is William S. Burroughs. To me, he's like the spitting image of, like, he is the age of Aquarius. It's going to be a lot like William S. Burroughs if we're lucky.
Yeah, I definitely like sense the archetypal like sort of footprint of Aquarius in this age, especially because that's the sign that I also fall under. All of the sort of psychosis and also the positive aspects I feel like exist within me as well, and it's definitely interesting. But just in terms of the digital animus, and in terms of how that manifests through the eyes of, because the animus is sort of an archetype that exists within the feminine psyche. It's sort of the amalgamations of impressions of what a masculine archetype is, blah blah blah. And I've sort of been also, as much as doing work with the divine feminine, I've also been doing a lot of work with the divine masculine as well. Because I started to sort of realize that the unintegrated and unexpressed masculine aspects within me were starting to become a hindrance. And I grew up without a dad, but I grew up with two older brothers, and they were sort of the only real like male influences in my life. And I realized that like stuff like discipline, focus, sticking to a task, being viable was very difficult for me because I had almost quote unquote a devouring mother. That was sort of she was very overprotective, and she was very kind of like, she was sort of very kind of like overbearing and stuff. So like I had a devouring mother and then no concept of the animus. So my animus was sort of formed through an amalgamation of like the male influences in my life and pop culture as well, specifically. Like pop culture massively shaped my animus. And I found that my animus was largely Dionysian and mercurial as well. So the Dionysian aspect for me and the mercurial aspect basically go hand in hand, which is why I tend to be attracted to, and I do a lot of animus projection on men who are creatively adept in some way. So a lot of musicians or people who work in the creative arts industries or intellectuals or, you know, those sorts of things are things that attract me to a man. And it's not as if I don't have those things already within me, but I find myself sometimes living vicariously through the creativity of the active masculine when I could be doing that myself and not necessarily sort of dealing with it. But then the Dionysian aspect, I also tend to be very drawn towards men or masculine figures that are quite a little bit chaotic and, you know, very hedonistic and, you know, people who are like a fun time, but there also has to be the mercurial kind of communicative, intellectual domain as well, sort of. And this has been positive in certain aspects in terms of like positive relationships that I have. But then with the less positive relationships with the men that I have in my life, it's been absolutely fucking catastrophic a lot of the time. And yeah, I feel like that's the way that a lot of women do animus projection, is by sort of living their masculinity vicariously through the men that they're with, or just sort of being caught up in the confluence of their life and not really paying attention to the cultivation of their own will. What do you think about how this manifests in terms of like the digital animus?
So I think ideally both partners incite one another to action, as the best relationships can do. You know, you get two people who fit each other's projections and are able to produce things because of that, because they have a circuit formed. But when you have a digital animus, the same problem occurs where you can feel as if you are being satisfied through these parasocial relations, as if, you know, this guy is cool, this guy is what I want out of somebody, but it leads to nothing. It creates nothing, it produces nothing. And of course, oftentimes, like for the digital animus, like it becomes perverse, much in the way that the digital anima becomes perverse. And it can lead to very negative relationships, much in the way that the misogyny is proliferated, misandry is proliferated as well, because this isn't my spirit, this isn't my animus. And especially, and this is one of the big problems, I think, is that both sides fall for aesthetics, and they see, like, one of the memes that I find to be like super important is like it'll be like, why are all the boys why do these guys act like soft boy leftists, but they're actually abusive? Like, it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yeah, it's a feature. It's a fucking feature. It's a fucking feature. I mean, even in the ones who like sort of, I don't necessarily identify with like masculine archetypes, there's still some in the ones that I've encountered anyway, especially because I tend to be attracted to like the more mercurial kind of type of dude. There's this like, there's they aesthetically or even in affect, they may sort of stay away from traditional masculinity. But when you really get to know them, their psyche, there's something about their psyche that's distinctly masculine. And that's not something that needs to be apologized for, or that needs to be, there's nothing wrong with that. But it seems as if there's this, the need to repress that then makes it manifest worse. It manifests really poorly. And I mean, back in the day, I mean, you had figures who were like distinctly mercurial and Dionysian, someone like a, I don't know, someone like a, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, exactly, like a David Bowie or like a Jim Morrison. There wasn't this sort of, and I don't know because obviously we don't know them personally, but there wasn't this, it wasn't a rejection of the masculine aspects of their psyche. It was almost a different and equally as potent form and manifestation of of masculinity. Whereas nowadays you see a lot of people who will stay away from what they associate with it and aesthetically sort of don what they deem as non-sort of traditional aesthetics, while repressing what already exists within them in a way that makes it manifest. And I see this all the time with men who sort of identify themselves as like left or whatever. It's this sort of rejection of the masculine that exists within them in a way that makes it manifest in often pernicious ways. And yeah, like you said, it's a bug, not a feature.
Well, I think much of it has to, I don't know how much of it is really self-hatred as much as a kind of need to fit in. It's a conformity. Because I know, at least in my own case, there is no question of like, am I going to repress masculinity to fit in? It does not occur. And I think that's one of the big problems, is that the upbringing is what causes young men to despise their own masculinity. They fit into, like, schools especially demonize masculinity. And it's something I see in therapy a lot, like a lot. And I think, and this is not like, I'm not trying to be super negative, but like a lot of people that go into therapy today, they go in because they were abused and they want to help people. That doesn't work. That's not how therapy works. It's like, because they don't actually, because they operate moralistically, because they were wounded, they view people who traumatize others as evil. It's not just like, this is what's going on, because that's all that it is. It's simply an interplay of energies. And that's why I find the new, maybe new age-ish obsession with narcissism, like that person's a narcissist, that person's toxic. That's a way of moralizing, simply like, this person hurt me, therefore they must be ill and evil. It's a denial of just, this is how life works. And so the therapist who is possessed of those ideas of the toxic person or the narcissistic person, they will oftentimes actually, like there was a case I just heard about recently. A guy went into therapy and he was saying that he was abused as a child, and the therapist says, are you must be abusing your kids. Are you, like, is that why you came here? Like, you must be abusing your own children. Like, you can't, a lot of, especially in men, can't talk about trauma without it being like, well, you must be evil, there must be evil in you. And I heard a psychology professor, like, who was a therapist, he would say, if you were in the office and a person came in and they were a pedophile, could you give them therapy, or would you not be able to treat them? That was the litmus test. Like, can you, or could you treat a murderer, or would it be a moral repugnance that prevents you from being able to treat? And I think, obviously they're not treating murderers and pedophiles, but they're treating just traumatized men. But because of that because of that history that wasn't actually dealt with psychoanalytically, it remains a prominent function.
It's so true. It's so true. And yeah, it also has a deleterious effect on one's ability to sort of form a healthy sort of animus. I remember in one of your videos, you talked about the sort of psychosexual dynamic that sort of exists between men and women. And I'm sorry that to my audience, to people who are non-heteronormative, and the only reason I'm not talking about that is because it's not my experience and I don't want to do anything wrong. But when you were talking about the sort of confluence between men and women, these different sort of psychological games we play, this sort of dance of courtship, things like neoliberal feminism have worked to sort of traumatize, pathologize, and almost criminalize certain things that have been ways that men and women have interacted with each other during the for aeons, basically. And it creates this sort of this fear and this sort of apprehensiveness when it comes to just like normal social standard interactions, and especially because we're more digitized now. Things like the nuance of body language or the nuance of facial expressions have kind of gone the by the wayside. The way that people sort of dating apps and things like that, a lot of it is through these mediated, often owned by capital sort of places, and that's kind of where that tango is happening, and it creates all this like resentment and weirdness and stuff. But one of the things that I've been doing in order to connect to my animus, I've been playing chess a lot recently, and it's because there's that show on Netflix, The Queen's Gambit, which was quite entertaining. I really enjoyed it, and I sort of saw the character in it as a woman who had a well-integrated animus, somebody who was unafraid of, because it was about a woman who's competing in this like male sport, but it wasn't like this like girl boss kind of like way of like, oh, look at her, isn't she wonderful? It was the fact that she is a person that's like dope at chess that just so happens to be a woman, and the men who she was sort of defeating, and the men who she were playing against, there wasn't this weird misogynistic contention, because she was in a male-dominated domain, and the way that you gain respect in that sort of competitive male-dominated domain is by competing, which is exactly what she did. So by default, they respected her, which is usually how my experience is whenever I enter these sort of competitive male-dominated domains. The way that you get respect isn't just, by showing off you're a good person or anything like that. It's by being competent and by being efficient at whatever.
Very much Camille Paglia's view, yeah.
Like I agree with her in that sense. Yeah. Is that and not just because of, but from my own personal experience, like they're usually not bad to you or misogynistic, and they usually treat you like an equal once you fucking do your job properly.
Exactly, but I find the same thing across oppressed. Like.
Yeah.
People who are incompetent think that they are being oppressed.
Yeah.
They are simply and it's not a question of like, oh, we should be bad, we should be mean to incompetent people. That's not what I'm saying. Just that you just have to look at things as they are and cause and effect. Like there's nothing more to it. You brought up something very important, which is that any lived experience of love or cruelty is anathema to capital.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like, and I guess that's the thing. This is why I struggle with leftism, because I am not opposed to the principle of capitalism, because at principle it is a game. At principle it is a game. The problem is that it is a game that has overtaken the game. It's treated as the only game when life is the real game. And capitalism is a scale model of life, and it's exchanged libido for currency. And clearly, it's a bad thing because it is not exact, because it prevents, and it is becoming more real. It is preventing the real experiences. But I think that the characteristics of it that are often derided are very occasionally just reality itself. Things that are, like, I think this is why Crowley is so important. Spirituality is not just love. He said love is very like great hate, cruelty, wickedness are real and integral to the human experience, and can't just be written off as, well, this is an oppressive system. Humanity. Life is an oppressive system. It's the point Nietzsche makes, which is that just by things coming into existence, it necessitates death. I mean, things are constantly dying for others to be created. So I think,
That's the thing. That's the thing is, like, I go by the Marxist definition of what capitalism is. And of course there has been exploitation and there's been a system of exchange, but that's not necessarily a Marxist definition of capitalism. Capitalism is a very specific system where there's a certain pecking order in terms of the owning class and the working class, and how the dynamic between those classes and the exchange and also the extraction of value works as well. Whereas what you're talking about is just life. And a lot of people on the left think that being anti-capitalist somehow, or leftist theory, is somehow supposed to be an antidote to the pain and the confusion and the alienation that's just sort of a result of being alive. which is what I think that you're getting at. And that's where I think that and that's where there's been a lot of these major encroachments, especially in academia, where this sort of neoliberal left sort of pokes its noses and tries to sort of shoehorn its theories into these areas of the human experience, these sort of universal areas, these universal problems that we've experienced even before the advent of capitalism, even before and again, like, it's a deterritorialization. Like, a lot of these neoliberal sort of postmodern academics are completely divorced from the historical continuum. They have no knowledge of anthropology or human origins or human history or the development of culture and society. In fact, they see that stuff as like reactionary. So they're completely untethered from history. Not just that, they're also completely untethered from nature. They have no knowledge of like other species and their biology, their habits. So they just sort of think that the present is all that exists and that's all that matters, and that there's no sort of through line that can be examined. And as a Marxist, we believe in historical materialism, which is the notion of sort of examining the material relations historically in order to come up with a better economic model that works for everyone. But it's not an antidote to all of the issues of human life and human psychology. And like you said, it's become a way of pathologizing people, pathologizing the world for, feeling alienated and rejected by it. And then there is this element of personal responsibility in terms of excavating yourself, understanding yourself. But that can only be done through experience and also engaging with other human beings. And that domain is being colonized by capital. There's no such thing as public space anymore. Even something like, we're now in the quote unquote COVID new normal, even something as innocuous as the cinema is dying. All these sort of communal hearths that we used to gather together around have been deterritorialized and colonized by capital. So even the room for that experience of individuation is sort of slowly closing down. I mean, and now that COVID has sort of introduced the new mode of neoliberalism with the lockdowns and the atomization and the different market forces that have come to cater to it, it seems as if that space for the individual development and growth through the experience of the world and of other people it's eroding.
I just think historical materialism doesn't explain what's going on as well as, say, Reich's view, where sexual forces, it's, a historical sexual understanding, a historical psychology, where, or even Hegel, if we witness the movements of spirit rather than of material forces. Because I just think at a basic level, Marxism is incapable of examining much of the most important aspects of the human experience, which are spiritual and sexual. Reich writes about it constantly, that the communists of his time wrote off sexuality as petty bourgeois, as unimportant to the working class. And to do so is to castrate yourself. Like, personally, I view much of what's going on now with lockdowns and such is more, it's not capital, it's people with the emotional plague as described by Reich, which are people that don't want to see life, they don't want to see movement. So the atomization is not just capital saying do that, it's people saying I want to be alone. It's trauma, it's traumatic responses. I do think culture, of course, but culture is a product of individuals' sexual characteristics. And if we look at the sexual dynamics at play in culture, we can understand what's going on, at least with a greater depth than simply the material analysis. Like, I think material analysis has its use and it's important and it's clearly necessary, but sexual analysis can't be understated. Spiritual analysis can't be understated.
I mean, the same, I know we talked about it earlier, but the same sort of argument happened with the Dadaists and the Communist Party in Zurich during the time where the communist movement was taking a lot of momentum, and the Dadaist movement was sort of emerged as a response to the kind of awful World War I devastation and the falling of the modernist mass narratives, all of those different things. And the Dadaist movement was made up largely, and Surrealism as well, was made up largely of radical leftists, people like Andre Bresson, Francis Picabia. These were all people who sort of identified with the radical left. But they had a massive falling out with the Communist Party because of the immaterial domain being sort of left by the wayside. The actual argument that I think it was Andre Bresson put forward was that the communists wanted a utilitarian art, one that sort of expressed, working class aspirations. They were sort of laying claim to human nature rather than using material conditions to unleash it. I believe that human potential, that so much potential, human potential, is wasted under a system that basically doesn't allow opportunity in a way, it doesn't distribute opportunity in a way that it should be. I mean, there's Einsteins who are living in poor conditions right now and will never get the access to education, to good quality of life, to the right nutrition, to the right healthcare, to the right opportunities that would enable them to reach their potential. And that's what material analysis is for. It's not supposed to be there in order to lay claim upon human nature or say this is what the view of the aspirations of working people are. This is what the aspirations of working people should be. This is what it believes. Like something like brutalist architecture, for instance, attempted in a very piss poor way to lay claim to human nature in a way that was sort of it was an over encroachment. But I don't think that the psychosexual dimension of human life, the immaterial, those drives necessarily, and paying attention to society through those mechanisms necessarily negates having a material analysis. The reason that I have a material analysis is because I want a world in which, or I hope for a world in which people are able to experience themselves and experience life. And it's not the sense that I'm saying, the atomization that we're all experiencing now is totally divorced from the individual. But those inclinations don't exist in a vacuum. As above, so below. Like, we live underneath a ruling ideology. And like I said, that ruling ideology is really good at making itself invisible. Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, the idea that, or Thatcher's, Margaret Thatcher's edict of there are no alternatives. The end of history, the Fukuyamaist end of history. We are living in an ideology that tries to pretend as if it's not an ideology. And the ruling ideology of neoliberalism definitely has a role in terms of how we view ourselves, how we view other people, how we view our culture, how we interact with our culture, how we interact with one another. And I think that any analysis that tries to obfuscate what is hegemonic is sort of missing a massive piece of the puzzle, because we're talking about the ruling ideology in that sense. But bringing it back, go ahead if you want.
Here's what I'll offer, and I think that this is really the tough pill, which is that it's easier to get into right-wing ideas.
Yeah.
And it's because we have to think, like, Breton and Surrealists and Dadaists critique leftism and split. But, 20 or 30 years later, Dali is Dali's a friend, or I suppose Dali is a Spaniard fascist. Picasso, I think many of them become fascists. Bernard Shaw, Ezra Pound. I would even say the majority of artists become fascist. And it is because the fascists are speaking to the sexual and to the spiritual side. It doesn't matter if at their essence they're operating materially. What matters is that they are able to whip up a fervor utilizing, and the left, in its commitment to its ideals, it loses sight. Like, I often think, like, how silly it is if communists just decided to become Catholics, they would achieve they would achieve a communist state, a communist Catholic state in a month, because they would be able to rally people around a spiritual idea, and the material would follow suit. You need to aim at a spiritual goal to change anything material. If it were a simple, like, and to me, this is also the difference between like cognitive behavioral therapy and psychoanalysis or talk therapy, where cognitive behavioral therapy is pretty much like, you are irrational, but you should be rational. Have you tried being rational? Just do the right thing, dummy. Whereas talk therapy is dealing with the irrational. It's not saying stop being irrational. Stop being. So that's the same thing.
If you're using that example, like for instance, I have like pretty bad OCD, and I've done a mixture of both cognitive behavioral therapy and talk therapy, and they both help, but in different ways. So the cognitive behavioral stuff helps me to interrogate the intrusive thoughts I have about, if I don't like step on this thing 3 times, then the world will end, or whatever the fuck goes through my head at the time. It helps me to interrogate and sort of neutralize those thoughts. But then the talk therapy helps me to sort of deal with the, like you said, to deal with it. So I don't feel like these things are in conflict with each other, but I do agree with you in the sense that the left has completely abandoned the symbolic and it's completely abandoned the immaterial domain, which is really how you make an impact, which is really how you make a lasting impact. And I feel like the left has also alienated artists. It's made itself creatively bankrupt. I mean, there was a meme that people were sharing the other day where they were like, oh, the only reason why right-wing people make better memes than left people is because their ideas are simplistic and ours are so complex. And it's like it's like the whole like you need to be super smart to understand Rick and Morty thing. It's this thing that's supposed to have a populist working class ethos is saying we're too smart to talk to the masses effectively. There is a really big problem, and I definitely 100% agree with you in terms of the neglect, the abandonment of the symbolic domain, and also the creative and artistic bankruptcy, and also this sort of weird need to encroach upon or to kind of lay siege to what human nature or what the nature of the proletariat should be. And I mean, the same argument happens when it comes to the idea of identity politics and class reductionism, quote unquote, which is a debate that's been going on the left. There are people like me who believe in a more broader approach to the material aspect, the people who we want a broader approach. We want people who come from different backgrounds to come together on shared interests. I don't care what your gender is. I don't give a fuck what race you are. I don't care what you believe in particular. If you're a racist or whatever that, and we have good material conditions, that doesn't affect me. That's just a fucking thought in your head at the end of the day. That's kind of the way that people view it. But then you have the left that's sort of very obsessed with identity politics. And they're like, oh, this sort of immaterial aspect of me, my identity, my essence, this is the most important thing. And we must approach politics from this vantage point. And anybody who is doing a rawly material analysis of it is a villain and is somebody who doesn't care about the effects of identity and is trying to obfuscate the things that people from different identities go through and blah, blah, blah. This is sort of the debate that's going on the left. And it's like, again, a clinical psychiatrist may take a quote unquote reductionist view of a patient in their office as, okay, here's the illness, here are the things to treat it. But it doesn't mean that they would dismiss the emotional distress or the immaterial things that their patient are going through as trivial. They're simply looking at things from a vantage point that allows them to take care of the basic things that will give their patient a better quality of life. Yeah, that's just how I see it.
If there were a viable symbolic role in the left, there would be no identity politics. It's a product of a nihilistic denial. And that's the thing. So that's what it just comes down to. There is no symbolic play. There is no symbolic awareness. And that's why they need identity politics.
Yeah. It sort of takes the place of,
It really, that's why it necessitates spiritual and sexual analysis
Mm-hmm.
to do anything. Material
Mm-hmm.
analysis, I think, has shown itself, especially now, incapable of dealing with what's going on. There must be a marriage of
Mm-hmm.
all these analytic forms
Mm-hmm.
into something potent.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I think they say there is no left, or what's left. All
Mm-hmm.
that's left are a series of methods that can be utilized by
Mm-hmm.
people who want to do something. That's all that's left.
Mm-hmm. I
And
definitely agree. Mm-hmm.
so I think that's all it comes down to. I think there's just no point in keeping that old hat idea.
Of
In
course.
keeping these old hat ideas, we need something potent
Mm-hmm.
and powerful and,
Mm-hmm.
dare I say, mimetic.
Yes.
Something that is so effective that it
Mm-hmm.
can spread and reproduce itself because it's not too complex. It should
Mm-hmm.
be simple. It should be able to be expressed with a meme. It
Mm-hmm.
should be able to spread that way.
Mm-hmm.
There is no excuse for
Mm-hmm.
the symbolic failure that has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just the duty of new artists who are capable of creating viable, effective symbolic forms to offer them up.
It's so true. It's so true. And I definitely agree with you. It has to be a synthesis and a marriage. It has to be that sort of as above, so below approach to the political, symbolic kind of domain. And yeah, there's a massive constituency though of people on the left who are sort of either vulgar materialists or who are totally that's the thing, is it's either you have vulgar materialism or you have people who are totally in the realm of identity politics and these sort of ethereal ideals of the self in that regard. And that's why there's this sort of massive void of actual action and actual tangible strategies and things that are able to sort of affect the mimetic domain. And I mean, it's not as if the sort of primordial ooze of the unconscious hasn't given us opportunities. I think the Joker was a massive fucking, it literally handed on a platter, right there. This sort of trickster god emerges out of, and this movie comes together. It's like sort of an amalgamation of Hollywood excess. I don't even think the film was conscious of itself. And the superhero genre, all of this, it wasn't even conscious of itself, but it sort of came and had this very sort of potent message that was rejected because the protagonist was a aggrieved white male or somebody who was economically disenfranchised, but because they didn't come from a historically marginalized background, it was like, oh, this is like an incel movie or whatever. And like it's the mimetic domain does this all the time. There are so many things that are produced out of it that could be seized upon by this ethos that just kind of are automatically rejected. And I think it's a general rejection of the libido, like you say. Like one of the places where I see the biggest annihilation of the libido is on the left, and the left is supposed to be the sexually liberated place where everybody is sort of experimental and blah. It's not, like, it really isn't. You have a lot of sexual pathology, dysfunction, and the libido is sort of encouraged to continue, is encouraged to sort of move in on itself. It's not encouraged to express itself out, or it's sort of being siphoned off by these like televangelist online kind of bread tube people who are like, yeah, give me let me extract value from you, give me the attention, give me your alienation, and I will transmute it into content for you, basically. So I think you're right 100%.
The future will be determined by those who can do that, by those who can create viable, real, lived, mimetic experience and power forms. I just think we're at a lull at the moment because of the internet, but I do think it's coming.
Definitely. I hope so. I hope to be a part of it as well. And I'm so glad that you're doing what you do. So just to round out quickly, I know that we said we wanted to talk about some of our personal experiences with the archetypes before we finish up. So first of all, I kind of wanted to ask if you're into spiritual practice, like what are you into? What archetypes do you work with? And then also, have you ever had an anima projection experience, either in real life or online? What was that like for you? What did it what sort of muck of the psyche did it bring out? And then I'll answer the question too, but you go first.
So I had like one of the really decisive moments for me was a anima dream where, yet again, like, because I was very young at the time and I was just getting into young. So it was kind of this ultimate confirmation, these big dreams, you know, when you have a really big dream, you can sense it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like not just a normal dream. I was interacting with the anima.
Mm.
And it was very powerful, and it really did it. I realized, like, this is, you know, this is the psyche, this is what's going on.
Mm.
My girlfriend had a really astounding dream where she saw her doppelganger. She saw a double of her, and she was like trying to think of like what to do, because she knew it was like, this is a bad part of her. And she said, "I love you," and it just laughed at her. And
Wow. Very Lynch.
Very powerful. And Lynch is, I always tell people, like, Twin Peaks is real.
Yes.
Everything that is described and shown in Twin Peaks is legitimate phenomena.
Yeah.
That's a part that's really not talked about much. A lot of people focus on the psychological aspects, but not a lot of people focus on the legitimate occult elements that are there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you read John Keel, if you read the Mothman prophecies, you'll see a lot of people that experience cryptids or monsters. A lot of what goes on in those situations is identical to Twin Peaks.
Mm.
It's very real, and a lot of people have these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. Like, you know, in our modern worldview, we've completely denied the existence of anything beyond,
Mm-hmm.
to necessitate and to make it easier to accept that, well, all my life is just sitting and staring at a box. There's nothing more out there, when in fact it is populate with madness, with joy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, you know, really, like, if a left wants to exist, it's going to need to believe in fairies.
Yeah, I agree. Agent Cooper is definitely a part of my animus for sure. But yeah, I'm a huge Twin Peaks fan. And yeah, I felt initially, especially in the scenes within the Black Lodge, this weird sense of familiarity. Especially because David Lynch uses a lot of dream logic in terms of how he shows the events. Like, that's sort of the logic that I see in my dreams. And then there's also the liminal space aspect of it, the way he's able to sort of create these liminal spaces. And I dream in liminal space terms. Most of my dreams are amalgamations and landscapes of different places I've been that have different emotional sort of signatures to them. And yeah, something about Twin Peaks is, and also in its depiction of the mystical, and in its depiction of the demonic too, in its depiction of the influences, the archetypal ones, that sort of, it's just so spot on. It's just so plausible. It's just so sort of real. Especially in The Return, the episode about the nuclear bomb and how that sort of like opened a doorway into our world. And also when you think about it in the mimetic sense as well, how these sort of mimetic hazards, there, as much as we're talking about memes and stuff, there's the mimetic hazards too. These, almost in a Lovecraftian sense, almost like Haster, these sort of forces that are able to invade our consciousnesses and make us, there's something distinctly like demonic about the way that works. And yeah, Twin Peaks was a key that unlocked quite a lot for me, and I'm still fascinated by it. Still rewatch it every winter. Yeah, it's a huge deal for me. But what about your own personal spiritual practice as well? What archetypes do you work with?
When I was younger, it was Mercury in particular. It was very strongly Mercury and Saturn. Those were two of the major figures for me, which is like Puer et Senex, which is the little boy and the old man, and kind of a fluctuation between those influences. But as I've matured, it has most certainly been Jupiter, and the role that Zeus and Jupiter play has become very, very important to me.
That's your dude, since you're a Sagittarius. Jupiter's your ruler. Yeah, I've got unpredictable Uranus energy for sure. What was I saying? So yeah, for me, because I exist in so many different cultural contexts. Like I'm a third generation Nigerian migrant to the UK. So we're like the gentry class of Nigeria. Like we're like the middle class of Nigeria, the sort of colonial educated middle class after World War II began migrating to Europe, specifically England, to rebuild the infrastructure. And, you know, it was this sort of educated class, the people who were sort of told to put aside their traditions and adopted this like very bland Anglican Christianity in order to sort of superimpose themselves into this like English middle class. So like that's the kind of trajectory that I come from. But even then, there was still something deep and distinctly African within my home growing up. Like my mom and my grandma would be discussing dreams that they had, or whenever the women in the family had like the same dream, they would discuss it. There were all these weird little ritual practices that were done and whenever I would ask, it would be like, oh, this is just for old folks. Like, you know, there were these whisperings of like occult weirdness that sort of led me down this like trajectory. And, you know, I grew up, had my like edgy atheist phase for a while because I was sort of rejecting the Christian paradigm that I had been raised in. And then I sort of came to Wicca, which was sort of my gateway drug, especially because I live on the British Isles and it's a very magical place to live. Like there's so much history and sacred sites, and, you know, even just the land itself has an energy to it that like is very, it's dark, but it's also very interesting, and it's also powerful, and it's also beautiful. There's so much here that it's just, yeah, it's crazy. Like America, Britain is also quite a bit of a haunted house in the sort of Kubrickian, Lynchian sense. But yeah, I got into that, and then I sort of got into ceremonial magic, traditional kind of ceremonial magic. I sort of, you know, fell into a Golden Dawn kind of group. And then I sort of moved away from that, and then moved more into reverence of the divine feminine, and joined a group that was sort of similar to that kind of thing. But now I'm sort of firmly, the whisperings from my childhood with the African stuff kind of brought me towards interest in the Yoruba religion. And I don't know, I just found an immediate resonance with it. And that's not to say that the European stuff doesn't resonate with me. It does. It's intrinsically part of me as well, because I live on this land and this is where I'm from. But the African spirituality really caught me. And we have a triune goddess. The three sort of major goddesses of the Yoruba pantheon are Oshun, who is sort of the goddess of love, wealth, beauty. She's associated with sexuality and pleasure and wealth. And we have Yemaya, who is the sea goddess, and she's the goddess of, she's like the mother goddess, basically. She has a lot to do with emotion, intuition, all of those different things, the moon, all of those different things. And then we have Oya, who is the goddess of winds and storms. And she's sort of the chaotic, dark feminine. She's associated with the graveyard, with swift change. So I work with all three of those forms of the divine feminine, and it's been very enriching for me to sort of experience these archetypes. In terms of animus, I've not done a whole lot of work with the divine masculine, but the ones that have stuck out the most to me have been Dionysus and all his forms, like Cernunnos. You know, the kind of horned man of the forest is a very big archetype that's close to my heart, and I've had quite a few sort of mystical encounters with this energy. And also Mercury as well has been a massive part of my sort of animus kind of thing. But in terms of projecting that onto people in real life, I have had experience. I have had one specific experience that was quite archetypal, and it was like a romantic experience. But it was kind of obvious that there was projection going on both sides. And a lot of people think that if you encounter someone who perfectly embodies your animus and they perfectly embody your anima, that it's going to be this like beautiful romantic thing. And it really isn't. It's terrifying. Like it's a catastrophe. It's a collision of psyches. But it also brings out all of these like very these very enriching psychological aspects within you. It's a sort of a collision that breaks you apart and makes you kind of look at yourself. It's almost like a mirror thing. And it was a very interesting experience, but it also made me realize that I'm quite vulnerable to animus projection, because there's a lot of unintegrated masculine aspects within me that I try to sort of project onto other people who I feel like fit those traits. What has your experience been with integrating your anima and experiencing your anima in the world?
Well, I would say that initially I was certainly like not happy, because I'd had a bad relationship with my own mother, but not in the way that not in the way that I described for the kids who watch my channel. It was the opposite. Instead of an overprotective, overbearing mother, I had none. So there was a vacuum, and I was not happy. I was not happy about that. And so at first I was not happy in my relationships, because I was looking for something that wasn't, there was nothing, you know? But as the anima took form in my dreams and I began to understand it more and more, I was able to integrate it and become really deeply romantic, because I was able to catch sight of it. But I think it took that having nothing into seeing it, rather than somebody who like has degrees, because somebody who has like good mother just won't have the need to deal with their anima. If they have an overbearing mother, they don't need to. That she's right there. She's in the flesh. Whereas by having nothing, I was able to see it as it is.
I had similar experience, because I also grew up without, like I said before, I grew up without a dad. So it was a very similar experience in terms of like not having that void there. There wasn't anything there that was filling it. Maybe like my brother's a little bit to an extent, but there's a natural contempt that you have for your siblings. I don't know what that is, but there's just like a natural contempt you have for your siblings. But again, I was able to sort of see it as it was. But then because because it sort of developed very quickly as well. I lose you. Sorry, I'm back. Are you still there? Oh, I think he's frozen. Hang on. Remove. Let me add him back. Hello.
Any better? I could hear you.
Are you still there? Okay, you can hear me. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying, because it wasn't there, it formed itself very quickly, and especially in terms of like pop culture and stuff, and it became very fixed. So you know how the concept of Jung, when it comes to animus projection and anima projection, how there are certain people who have types. Mine became very sort of fixated on like a specific thing, which definitely had some deleterious effects for sure. But it's been really, your channel has really helped me analyze a lot of this stuff. I'm really looking forward to your series on the animus, since you've done the anima. It's been a huge fucking awakening experience, and it's gotten me interested in Jung again in a very, very kind of four-dimensional way. I feel like the exploration of Jung, that I see online, has been mostly very one-dimensional, and it's one thing to read it on your own. It's another thing to have other people who are interested in it talking about it. You can kind of unpick each other's brains and things like that. So yeah, it's been massively eye-opening. Does anyone else ever feel called out by your videos? Have you ever had the experience of people saying they feel called out by your content?
Absolutely. And I think that's the appeal of it, really, is that there is nobody else who's, just like we were talking about, that there's a symbolic vacuum. There's nobody who cares about these people. Like, I was going to mention the movie The Face When No GF, the documentary from Alex Lee Moyer. And she was heavily criticized because she talked to incels and wasn't just like, you are fucked up. She was trying to understand them. And it's like, we have the youth who want to be libidinal. They want to move. They want to live. And instead, pretty much everybody's like, fuck you. You're nothing. Go away. Stay inside. And I'm looking and I'm like, we got some great people here ready to do things. They're very creative. They're creating memes constantly, internet stuff. There's so much art. I just say, yes, let's do it physically. Let's materialize this. So to do that, we have to understand, like, how did this happen? Where are you? Like, in terms of psychic locality, like, you're online, but we got to get out into the real world. So I think a lot of people feel called out because I am speaking to a type that nobody has ever spoken to before, for the most part, or at least never intentionally is paying attention to this type. You know, there's other relatable content, but I don't think there's content that pays attention to the every man of the internet today.
I totally agree. And I think it's a very important project. And I think that the work you do in terms of like the psychoanalysis of memes and sort of using them as a key to tap into the collective unconscious is definitely incredibly valuable scholarship. So kudos to you. And thank you so fucking much for coming and talking to me today. I really fucking appreciate it. And I need to have you back on because I could definitely continue this conversation just like forever. And this is probably the most interesting conversation I've had in a while. So thank you very much. Thank you. Is there anything that you want to plug quickly before we end the night, or do you want to let people know where to find you or anything like that?
Subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow me at the God Disc on Twitter. That's pretty much it. I don't really have anything else.
No problem. There's a link to meme analysis in the description. Go subscribe if you haven't already. And check out the Goth GF video, which is your latest one, which was very, very good. Thank you guys in the audience for listening, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye.